At 2:47 p.m. on August 18, 1944, Lieutenant Royce Priest saw his squadron commander's P-51 Mustang burst into flames over occupied France. Thick black smoke streamed from the engine as the damaged fighter dropped toward a wheat field roughly 20 miles behind German lines. Priest was only 21 years old. He had been in combat for just 2 months. And now the man he respected most was about to become a prisoner of war. The disaster began with a trap the Germans had carefully prepared. Hidden inside a railway boxcar was an anti-aircraft battery designed to ambush low-flying fighters. When Major Bert Marshall led his 4-aircraft element into a strafing run near Saint-Nazaire, the sides of the railcar suddenly fell away, revealing 20mm and 40mm guns already aimed directly at them. The ambush hit at extremely close range, leaving almost no time to react. By August 1944, American fighter pilots were being lost over France at a frightening pace. German flak crews had become experts at concealment. They disguised gun positions as farm buildings, haystacks, and now even railway cars, sometimes marked with Red Cross symbols to look harmless from the air. Low-altitude missions had become a deadly gamble. The 355th Fighter Group alone had lost 17 pilots in the previous 2 months. Some died instantly. Others crash-landed behind enemy lines and spent the rest of the war in prison camps. A few simply disappeared, their final moments never confirmed. Major Marshall wasn't even supposed to be flying that day. As commander of the 354th Fighter Squadron, he could have assigned the mission to his flight leaders. But Marshall was known for leading from the front. He had arrived in the squadron in early June with barely 3 hours of P-51 time after switching over from the P-40. His second combat mission had been D-Day itself. On June 6, he shot down a German Ju-87 over the Normandy beaches. 2 weeks later, he destroyed 2 Bf-109s. By early August, he had 5 confirmed kills, becoming an ace faster than anyone in the history of the 355th Fighter Group. His bold flying style earned him promotion after promotion in record time. Now that same aggressiveness had placed him inside a burning cockpit over enemy territory. Royce Priest had admired Bert Marshall long before the war. Marshall had been a standout quarterback in Texas, and later received national recognition at Vanderbilt University. When Priest learned they were assigned to the same squadron, he felt like he'd been handed the greatest opportunity of his military life. He studied Marshall's tactics, copied his maneuvers, and tried to learn everything he could from the older pilot. Now he watched helplessly as Marshall's Mustang descended in flames. The Merlin engine had been hit beneath the exhaust stacks. Another round had torn into the radiator system, sending coolant spilling into the air behind the aircraft. The fighter had only minutes left before the engine failed completely. Standard procedure was clear. If a pilot went down behind enemy lines, his wingmen were supposed to mark the location, radio the coordinates, and return to base. Attempting a pickup was not just discouraged, it was treated as impossible. The P-51 was a single-seat fighter. There was no passenger space, no plan for landing in enemy farmland, and no training for what Priest was about to attempt. If you enjoy stories like this, support WW2 Impact by hitting the like button. It helps YouTube share these forgotten moments with more people. Subscribe if you haven't already. Now back to the mission. Marshall's burning Mustang vanished below the treeline. Priest immediately pushed his nose down and began descending toward the same wheat field. His radio crackled with Marshall's voice ordering him to abort and head back. Priest's hand moved toward the radio switch. He could acknowledge the order and turn for England. He could follow regulations and let the Germans take Marshall. But his hand stopped. He had already decided. The P-51 was never designed to land in a wheat field. Its liquid-cooled Merlin engine sat low in the fuselage, with a radiator scoop hanging beneath the belly. Anything taller than 18 inches could smash the cooling system and destroy the engine. The landing gear was built for paved runways, not soft farmland. A hidden rut or rock could snap a strut and flip the fighter over. Priest ignored every risk. He lowered his flaps to 40 degrees, slowed to about 90 miles per hour, and lined up with the longest stretch of wheat he could find. The Mustang's nose blocked most of his forward view during the approach, forcing him to judge altitude by looking out the side of the canopy. The wheels hit hard. The aircraft bounced once, then again, then finally settled into the soft earth. Wheat stalks slapped against the fuselage as Priest braked hard. The fighter shuddered, slowed, and stopped about 300 yards from the treeline where Marshall's aircraft had gone down. Priest immediately turned the Mustang around to face the direction he'd come from. If he needed to escape fast, he couldn't waste time turning later. The field stretched roughly 800 yards into the wind. It wasn't ideal, but it was all he had. Above him, the two remaining pilots from his flight circled at 1,500 feet. They had watched his landing in disbelief. Now they scanned nearby roads and hedgerows for German movement. Within seconds they spotted it. A military truck appeared on a dirt road half a mile to the east, racing toward the field. The canvas cover suggested infantry inside. Priest estimated 20 to 30 soldiers. The two Mustangs overhead rolled into attack runs immediately. Their 6.50 caliber machine guns could unleash a devastating stream of fire. The lead pilot opened up from around 400 yards, walking tracers into the truck's engine. The vehicle swerved, caught fire, and crashed into a ditch. The second Mustang strafed the wreckage to make sure no one reached the wheat field. But the danger wasn't over. Another truck approached from the north. A motorcycle with a sidecar appeared from the south. German patrols were converging from multiple directions. Priest stood in the cockpit, scanning the tree for Marshall. Smoke rose from the woods. Marshall would have destroyed his aircraft by now. Pilots carried thermite grenades specifically to burn wrecked fighters and prevent their equipment from falling into enemy hands. The Merlin engine, the gun sight, the transponder, everything had to be denied to the Germans. 2 minutes passed. Still no Marshall. The Mustangs overhead made another strafing pass at the motorcycle, scattering its riders into a hedgerow. Priest looked down at the ground. The soft field had left deep ruts behind his wheels. A takeoff would require full power and every inch of runway. Adding a second man would make the aircraft heavier than it was meant to be, increasing stall speed and stretching the takeoff roll. The numbers were brutal. He might not have enough space. 3 minutes. Still nothing. The second truck had stopped about a quarter mile away. Priest could see soldiers dismounting and spreading into a line, advancing through the wheat on foot. Then a figure burst from the tree. Major Burt Marshall was running toward the Mustang. His flight suit was blackened with soot, and his face was filled with anger. He wasn't waving in relief. He was waving in fury, shouting for Priest to leave immediately. Priest did the only thing he could think of. He climbed out of the cockpit, unbuckled his parachute harness, and dropped it onto the wing. Then he pulled out his survival dinghy and threw it into the wheat. Without a parachute, he couldn't bail out if the engine failed. Without the dinghy, he would die if they ditched in the English Channel. Priest was making one thing clear: he was not leaving without Marshall. Marshall stopped, staring at the discarded equipment. The German soldiers were now visible above the wheat, their helmets bobbing as they pushed closer. The escort Mustangs had burned through most of their ammunition on the trucks. They might have one more strafing pass, maybe two, before their guns were empty. Marshall sprinted the final distance and climbed onto the wing. The cockpit of a P-51D was cramped even for one man in full gear. It was roughly 38 inches wide, and barely tall enough under the canopy for a pilot wearing a helmet and parachute. It was never meant for two grown men. Marshall was about 5'11" and around 170 pounds. Priest was slightly smaller, but still wearing the same heavy flight gear. Together, they were about to squeeze into a space designed for a single pilot. Marshall lowered himself into the cockpit first, sliding down as far as possible. He pressed his back against the armored seat plate and stretched his legs forward beneath the instrument panel, alongside the control stick. Priest climbed in next, settling onto Marshall's lap. Their bodies were packed together like cargo. The stick rose between Priest's knees. His shoulders pressed against Marshall's chest. Their heads nearly touched the canopy glass. Priest reached up and pulled the canopy closed. It latched with barely any clearance above his helmet. Inside, the air was suffocating. August heat turned the cockpit into an oven. Sweat immediately soaked through their flight suits. Priest's knees blocked part of the instrument panel, but he could still see what mattered most. Fuel pressure. Oil temperature. Manifold pressure. He pushed the throttle forward and felt the Merlin engine surge to full power. The fighter lurched ahead through the wheat. The acceleration was slow, too slow. Two pilots, ammunition, and remaining fuel pushed the Mustang far beyond its intended weight limit. Soft earth dragged at the wheels. Wheat stalks hammered the radiator scoop beneath the fuselage. Priest watched the airspeed climb. 60 miles per hour. 70. 80. The tree at the end of the field rushed closer. A normal Mustang might lift off around 100 miles per hour. With the extra weight, Priest guessed he needed at least 115. The airspeed needle passed 95 as the trees filled his view. He pulled back gently. The wheels lifted, and the aircraft staggered into the air, barely climbing. Warning horns screamed in his ears. The treetops passed beneath them by what felt like inches. Branches scraped the belly of the fighter. Then they cleared the trees. They were airborne. 2 men inside a single-seat fighter, alive against every expectation. Behind them, German soldiers reached the edge of the wheat field and watched the Mustang climb away. Their target had escaped, but Priest and Marshall were still far from safety. England was still 200 miles away. The aircraft was dangerously overweight. The engine was straining. Somewhere ahead, German fighters could be hunting for anything slow and vulnerable. The 2 escort Mustangs formed up on either side as Priest climbed toward 8,000 feet. Their mission had changed from attacking to protecting. With ammunition nearly gone, they couldn't fight effectively, but they could watch the sky and guide the overloaded aircraft home. Priest reduced power to cruise settings to cool the engine. The temperature gauge had been rising since takeoff, and he needed to keep the Merlin from destroying itself. The radiator scoop had swallowed wheat and debris during the ground roll, restricting airflow through the cooling system. 180 miles of enemy held France before reaching the coast. German flak batteries dotted the landscape. Luftwaffe airfields could scramble interceptors quickly if spotters reported American aircraft. Priest flew low enough to avoid easy radar detection, but high enough that he could glide to a landing if the engine quit. Inside the cockpit, the heat became unbearable. The closed canopy trapped sunlight like a greenhouse. Both men were drenched. Marshall, pinned beneath Priest, absorbed the full weight pressing down on his legs. Within minutes, his circulation began to fail. First his feet went numb, then his calves, then his thighs. He couldn't shift even slightly. Priest focused on flying. With the stick jammed between his knees and his elbows pinned by the cockpit walls, every movement had to be careful. A sudden input could jam the controls against Marshall's legs and send the aircraft into a dangerous roll. The escort pilots watched Priest's engine cowling with concern. Coolant began streaming out, leaving a pale trail behind the aircraft. The Merlin was slowly cooking itself. If the temperature kept climbing, they estimated the engine might fail in 15 to 20 minutes. Priest saw the same warning signs on his gauges. He had a choice. He could slow down to protect the engine, but risk not reaching the channel quickly enough. Or he could keep speed and hope the engine held together long enough to reach friendly territory. He chose speed. Better to go down in the channel, where rescue boats might reach them, than crash back in occupied France where German patrols would be waiting. After 47 minutes, the French coastline came into view. The Cotentin Peninsula passed beneath them, now in Allied hands after the Normandy breakout. Priest allowed himself a brief moment of relief. They were out of enemy territory. If the engine failed now, they would land among friendly forces. Ahead lay the English Channel, 21 miles of cold water separating France from safety. Priest had thrown away his dinghy in the wheat field. Marshall had lost his with the burning aircraft. If they ditched in the sea, either man would last long in the freezing current. Halfway across, the temperature gauge touched the red line. Priest stared at the needle, waiting for the moment the engine would suddenly go silent. But the Merlin kept running, coughing through the strain. Then England appeared through the haze. White cliffs. Green fields. The unmistakable coastline. The Mustang crossed into English airspace with its engines still alive. Priest began descending towards Steeple Morden, the 355th Fighter Group's home base in Cambridgeshire. The runway was still 60 miles ahead. The engine was still overheating. He had saved his commander from capture. Now he had to save them both from the aircraft itself. 12 miles from the airfield, the engine began to misfire. The steady roar broke into an uneven stutter as overheated cylinders started failing. Priest enriched the mixture and silently begged the engine to survive a few more minutes. The base appeared in the summer haze. 2 concrete runways formed an X across the countryside. Fire trucks and ambulances were already positioned along the main strip. The tower had received reports from the escort pilots. Everyone on the ground knew something impossible was approaching. Priest entered the pattern at around 140 miles per hour, much faster than normal. The overloaded Mustang needed the speed to stay flying. He lowered the landing gear and felt the reassuring clunk as the wheels locked. He brought the flaps down in stages to 40 degrees. The aircraft rose slightly, then settled into a stable approach. The runway rushed up. Priest flared gently and felt the main wheels touch concrete. The tail dropped. The fighter rolled straight down the center line, slowing smoothly. The engine was coughing and sputtering, but still turning. Priest applied the brakes and brought the aircraft to a stop halfway down the runway. Ground crews sprinted toward the fighter before the propeller even stopped. They expected to find a wounded pilot, maybe a dying man who had somehow dragged a crippled aircraft home. Instead, they saw something no one had ever witnessed. Two pilots unfolded from a single cockpit like performers climbing out of a box that should have been too small for one person, let alone two. Marshall couldn't walk. His legs had been crushed under Priest's weight for nearly 2 hours. When he tried to stand, he collapsed. Ground crew members lifted him and carried him to an ambulance. Priest climbed down on his own, drenched in sweat, shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline. The story spread across the 355th Fighter Group within minutes. Pilots gathered around the Mustang to see proof with their own eyes. Wheat stalks were jammed into openings all over the aircraft. The radiator scoop was packed with vegetation. Oil streaked the cowling where the overheated engine had started leaking. The crew chief estimated the Merlin had been seconds away from seizing when Priest shut it down. Mechanics spent 2 full days cleaning and repairing the fighter. They pulled wheat stubble from the landing gear wells, the tailwheel housing, the radiator fins, and even the gun ports. The radiator had to be taken apart to remove debris. Several coolant lines needed replacement. The engine required inspection and partial rebuilding. What Priest had done was unheard of in the 8th Air Force. Other pilots had tried to land behind enemy lines to retrieve comrades. Most attempts ended in disaster. Fighters flipped in soft ground, crashed into obstacles, or were destroyed before they could escape. No one had successfully landed a single-seat fighter in enemy territory, loaded a second pilot into the cockpit, and flown home. That evening, the report reached Group Headquarters. By morning, the story had climbed all the way to 8th Air Force Command. But leadership now faced an uncomfortable problem. Lieutenant Priest had disobeyed a direct order from his commanding officer, twice. He had risked a valuable aircraft, risked his own life, and carried out an unauthorized rescue. Regulations said he should face a court-martial. But he had also saved one of the most promising squadron commanders in the European theater. Major Marshall was an ace. A proven leader. A pilot whose aggressive tactics inspired others. Losing him to capture would have been a major blow. The decision ended up on the desk of Major General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force. The same Doolittle who had led the famous Tokyo raid in 1942 now had to judge a young lieutenant who had done something both heroic and insubordinate. Doolittle knew what impossible risk looked like. In 1942, he launched 16 B-25 bombers from an aircraft carrier, knowing none of them could return. Every plane was lost, crash-landed, or abandoned. 8 men were captured. 3 were executed. Doolittle had expected punishment for losing all 16 aircraft. Instead, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. Now he faced a strange reflection of that same situation. A pilot had taken an unauthorized risk, succeeded, and returned alive. Doolittle requested the full reports from the 355th Fighter Group. He reviewed radio logs, witness statements from the escort pilots, and maintenance records documenting the condition of Priest's aircraft. The facts were clear. Marshall had ordered Priest to abort. Priest had acknowledged the order. Then he ignored it and landed anyway. On the ground, Marshall ordered him again to leave. Priest ignored that too. Under military law, disobeying an order in combat was a serious offense. Punishments could range from demotion to prison. In extreme cases, it could even mean execution. The chain of command existed for a reason. If every pilot acted on personal judgment, coordination could collapse. But Doolittle understood another reality. The 8th Air Force was losing experienced pilots faster than replacements could be trained. Every veteran who survived another mission increased the chances of survival for the men around him. And Marshall wasn't just any pilot. He was a squadron commander. An ace. A tactical leader whose influence extended beyond his own cockpit. Capturing him would damage morale and effectiveness. There was also something else to consider. The war was reaching a critical stage. Allied forces were pushing across France. The Luftwaffe was weakening but still deadly. American pilots needed to believe they wouldn't be abandoned if they went down. Priest's rescue proved something powerful. The loyalty between pilots could overcome fear, orders, and even logic. Doolittle spent 3 days weighing the decision. He consulted his staff and searched for similar cases. None matched perfectly. Rescue attempts behind enemy lines had happened before, but they usually ended in failure, turning one lost pilot into two. Priest was the first to succeed. Doolittle decided he would not court-martial Priest. Instead, he initially planned to recommend him for the Medal of Honor. But there was a problem. Doolittle worried about the message such an award could send. If other pilots tried to copy the stunt and failed, the cost would be measured in lives and aircraft. The 8th Air Force could not afford to encourage reckless rescue attempts, no matter how noble. So Doolittle changed the recommendation. Instead of the Medal of Honor, he pushed for the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. It would recognize Priest's courage and skill without turning the act into an officially celebrated example for others to follow. The paperwork moved upward through the system and was approved. A ceremony was scheduled at Steeple Morton for late September. Lieutenant Priest would receive his medal personally from General Doolittle. On September 21, 1944, pilots from all three squadrons of the 355th Fighter Group assembled on the flight line. Ground crews stopped working to watch. The group commander stood beside General Doolittle as Priest marched forward. Doolittle pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to Priest's chest. The ribbon hung beneath the Silver Cross, a decoration that carried immense weight. It was the same award Doolittle himself had once received before it was later upgraded to the Medal of Honor. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. After pinning the medal, Doolittle held Priest's hand for a moment, and looked him in the eyes. Then he delivered the message he had prepared. He told Priest he had never considered making a rule to stop pilots from landing behind enemy lines to rescue comrades, because the idea seemed so reckless that no sane person would attempt it. Priest had proven that assumption wrong. What Priest had done, Doolittle said, was one of the bravest things he had seen in 2 years of command, and also one of the most foolish. The medal recognized the bravery. The decision not to award the Medal of Honor acknowledged the foolishness. Priest accepted the decoration without complaint. He had expected punishment, not praise. The Distinguished Service Cross was more than he ever imagined he would receive. Years later, in a letter to Marshall's son, Priest admitted the most stressful part of the entire ordeal wasn't the flight itself. The flight was terrifying, yes, but the waiting afterward, not knowing whether he would be court-martialed, was even worse. The rescue quickly became legend within the 8th Air Force. It was remembered as the first successful, piggyback, extraction using a P-51 Mustang. And it didn't remain the only one. Priest's example encouraged other pilots to attempt similar rescues in the months that followed. Some succeeded. Others failed. 10 days later, on August 28, another pilot from the 355th landed in occupied France to save a downed comrade. His aircraft got stuck in mud. Both men escaped capture and eventually reached Allied lines on foot. On October 3, 2 more rescue attempts happened on the same day. One succeeded. The other failed when the fighter bogged down in soft ground, and both pilots were captured. The pattern became clear. Sometimes the gamble worked. Other times it doubled the loss. On November 18, 1944, First Lieutenant Jack Ilfrey carried out a successful rescue for the 20th Fighter Group, landing in a pasture and extracting his wingman under enemy fire. On March 18, 1945, another rescue was recorded when a pilot saved Captain William McKinnon from occupied Germany. By the end of the war, the 8th Air Force documented at least 5 successful single-seat fighter rescues. An unknown number of attempts ended in disaster. The tactic was never officially approved. It was never formally banned either. Commanders simply looked the other way when pilots chose to risk everything for each other. Major Marshall returned to duty only days after the rescue. His legs recovered fully. He continued leading the 354th Fighter Squadron through the fall of 1944, adding victories and earning a Silver Star for leadership. By October, he had been promoted to lieutenant colonel and appointed deputy commander of the 355th Fighter Group. When another rescue attempt in his squadron later ended with 2 pilots captured, Marshall felt the weight of what Priest's example had unleashed. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Marshall survived. Priest survived. The Mustang that carried them home was repaired, returned to service, and flew additional missions until Germany surrendered. But for both men, that afternoon in the wheat field never truly ended. It stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Royce Priest remained in the Air Force and retired in 1968 after 28 years of service. His career carried him far beyond France. He served as a personal pilot to the President of Chile, where he met his wife Anita. He trained pilots for Allied nations and later flew jets that would have seemed impossible to the young lieutenant who once landed a propeller-driven fighter behind enemy lines. The Distinguished Service Cross remained his most treasured award. He rarely spoke about the rescue unless someone asked him directly. Even then, he often shifted credit to the escort pilots who kept German troops at bay, and to the ground crews who rebuilt his battered aircraft afterward. He saw himself as lucky, not heroic. Bert Marshall finished the war as commander of the 355th Fighter Group with 7 confirmed aerial victories. The Silver Star he received reflected his leadership during some of the harshest air fighting in Europe. After the war, he continued serving, eventually commanding fighter units in Japan during the occupation. His athletic legacy was later recognized when he was inducted into the Texas Sports Hall of Fame in 1971. The two men remained close friends throughout their lives. Their bond had been forged in a cockpit barely wide enough for one person, flying over enemy territory with an engine on the edge of failure, and no parachutes to save them if things went wrong. That kind of memory doesn't fade. In December 2002, Colonel Priest wrote a letter to Bill Marshall, Bert's son. It became the most detailed first-hand description of the rescue ever recorded. Priest explained the hidden flak trap, the burning Mustang, the desperate landing, and the agonizing flight back to England. He wrote about the fear he felt while waiting to learn if he would be punished. He wrote about the moment Doolittle pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to his uniform. But most importantly, he explained why he did it. Bert Marshall had been his hero long before the war. Serving in the same squadron felt like fate. When Marshall's aircraft caught fire over France, Priest didn't calculate odds or weigh regulations. He simply refused to leave his hero behind in a German prison camp. Colonel Royce Priest passed away on May 18, 2004, in Riverside, California. He was 81 years old. His obituary described him as one of the few remaining World War II fighter aces and a recipient of the nation's second highest award for valor. It mentioned his long service, his time in Chile, and his devotion to his family. It did not mention that he once carried 2 men inside a single-seat fighter and flew them home through enemy territory. Some stories are too unbelievable to fit into an obituary. The P-51 Mustang that saved them was never preserved as a museum exhibit. It finished the war, was likely sold as surplus afterward, and disappeared into history like thousands of other aircraft. No plaque marks the site of the first successful piggyback rescue in 8th Air Force history. But the story survived anyway. It passed from pilot to pilot, from veterans to historians, from fathers to sons. Bill Marshall later wrote books about his father's squadron, and both included the rescue that saved his father's life. If this story hit you the way it hit us, do WW2 Impact a favor and press like. Every single like tells YouTube to push this story to more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we bring forgotten history back to life every day. And drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Are you in the United States, the UK, Canada, Australia, or somewhere else? Our community is worldwide. You're not just a viewer, you're helping keep these memories alive. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us your country. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Royce Priest and Bert Marshall are remembered.